The streets of Manhattan had become something beyond recognizable. No longer a grid of possibility, but a labyrinth of dread. Driving now was a delicate dance, each turn a calculated risk, each stretch of road a gamble. I'd spent days threading this needle, pushing my luck through alleys and underpasses, avoiding the traps of what the city had become. That night, I thought I could outwit the maze again. Leah sat in the back seat, clutching a threadbare backpack like it held her soul. She hadn't spoken since climbing in, and I hadn't asked her to. The fewer words exchanged, the easier it was to pretend this was just another job, just another fare in a city that hadn't rotted from the inside out. The car rattled as I turned down another street, the pavement littered with debris, shattered glass, abandoned bicycles, a lone, overturned stroller. My headlights cut through the night in short, uneven bursts, illuminating pockets of devastation before fading back into shadow. "We'll take Broadway," I muttered to myself, though Leah likely heard. The route seemed clear enough. It wasn't. Ahead, a cluster of figures shuffled into view, their movements jerky and unnatural, their faces lost in shadow. My foot hesitated over the brake. A dozen at first, then more. They poured in from doorways and alleys, their bodies colliding awkwardly as if puppets dragged by unseen strings. "No," I whispered, gripping the wheel tighter. I swung the car around, the tires screeching against the uneven pavement. The alley behind us was narrow, the kind of place I'd once avoided for fear of petty crime. Now it was my only escape. The cab jolted violently as I veered into the alley, its walls rising sharply on either side. My hands were slick against the wheel, and I could hear Leah's breathing quicken in the back seat, though she said nothing. The alley ended before I expected it to, a brick wall looming large, cutting off any chance of escape. The cab skidded to a halt, the front bumper kissing the wall with a sickening crunch. The figures had followed. In the rearview mirror, I saw them flood the alley's entrance, their outlines smudged and distorted in the dim light. They moved as one now, a tide that swallowed everything in its path. For a moment I froze. My hands gripped the wheel as if it could still save us. The car's engine idled, a hollow sound in the suffocating silence. "They'll reach us," Leah said softly, her voice cutting through the haze of panic. Her calm was chilling. I glanced at her reflection. She didn't look afraid, just resigned, as if she'd already considered this moment and made peace with it. The tide drew closer, the grotesque scrape of their steps echoing off the alley walls. I fumbled for the tire iron under my seat, its cold metal reassuring in a way nothing else could be. "Stay in the car," I said, though my voice barely felt like my own. I stepped out into the night, the air thick with the stench of rot and the coppery tang of something worse. The wall behind me was unforgiving, the alley narrowing with each step the horde took. There was nowhere left to go. The wall loomed ahead, impenetrable, taunting. My grip tightened on the wheel, the cold metal of the tire iron still pressing against my thigh where I'd wedged it. Behind me, the murmur of the dead was growing, low and inescapable, like the pull of a tide that had already swallowed countless before me. Leah sat rigid in the back seat, her eyes locked on the horde. "They're coming closer," she said. Not in panic, but with the quiet finality of someone pointing out rain on a window pane. I didn't answer. Words wouldn't matter now, and the gnawing sense that I'd brought us to this edge was too heavy to let me speak. Instead, I stared through the windshield at the boarded-up storefront ahead. The glass was already fractured, spiderwebs of cracks catching the pale light of my headlights. An idea formed, sharp and desperate. I slammed the car into reverse, the wheels spinning before the cab lurched backward, the horde growing impossibly close. Then I shifted to drive and pressed the accelerator to the floor. The cab screamed forward, and I braced as the impact shattered the glass and sent us barreling into the darkened store. Shelves crumpled like paper under the weight of the car, their contents scattering in a cacophony of sound. When we finally stopped, the engine sputtered and died, leaving only the distant moans behind us. Out, I snapped, throwing the door open. Leah followed, clutching her bag. The air inside was thick with dust and the scent of mildew. Broken mannequins lay strewn across the floor, their blank faces eerily disjointed in the faint moonlight streaming through the gaping hole where the cab now sat. "This way," I said, pointing toward the rear of the store. My plan was thin, held together by little more than instinct. If we could get to the back, find a fire escape or a delivery door, maybe we could outpace them. Maybe. We moved quickly, the sound of broken glass crunching underfoot as I scanned the darkened aisles for any sign of movement. The store's silence was oppressive, and every corner felt like a trap waiting to spring. When we reached the back, my hope faltered. The door was there, yes, but through its small, grimy window, I could see the street behind. The horde was already spilling into it, their shapes unnervingly fluid as they pressed forward. Leah saw it too. "Now what?" she asked, her voice sharper now, though still devoid of panic. To the left, a stairwell door stood ajar, its rusted hinges barely holding it in place. I gestured toward it, already moving. "We'll go up." The stairs were narrow, their metal grates echoing underfoot as we climbed. My legs ached with each step, the weight of exhaustion and fear pressing harder with every flight. Behind us, I heard the sound that made my chest tighten. The scrape of the stairwell door slamming open, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of pursuit. "They're coming," Leah said, no louder than she needed to. I didn't look back. There was no need to confirm what I already knew. The stairwell seemed endless, each turn revealing another set of stairs spiraling upward into the dark. My breath came in ragged bursts, my muscles burning with the effort to keep moving. Leah was ahead of me now, her smaller frame more nimble on the treacherous steps. She didn't slow, didn't hesitate, even as the sounds below grew louder. The clatter of feet on metal, the low, guttural moans that reverberated through the narrow space. When we reached the top, the final door was locked. I threw myself against it, the handle rattling uselessly in my grip. Leah stood beside me, her eyes scanning the landing for anything that could help. "They'll be here," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. I knew she was right. The sound of the horde was closer now, their pursuit relentless. The metal grates beneath us seemed to hum with their weight, a reminder that no door, no height, could keep us safe forever. The rooftop was smaller than I had imagined. It was a prison masquerading as a refuge, bordered by a low wall on 3 sides and a mechanical unit on the 4th, humming softly in defiance of the world's collapse. Above us, the sky churned, swollen with clouds the color of tarnished metal. The air had grown heavy, promising rain. A storm that felt less like salvation and more like the sky mourning what was left below. The door rattled behind us. It wasn't the occasional creak of loose hinges, but a persistent, deliberate pounding, as if the horde had suddenly gained purpose. I pressed my shoulder against it, my boots skidding slightly on the wet surface. Leah stood a few feet away, her back to me, staring at the building across the alley. "There's someone there," she said, her voice tight with urgency. I followed her gaze. The windows of the adjacent building were lit in stark contrast to our shadowed perch. A handful of shapes moved inside, figures that seemed impossibly human in their mundanity. One leaned close to the glass, staring out, though whether at us or simply at the endless ruin around them, I couldn't tell. "Help," Leah called, waving her arms. She stepped closer to the edge, the toes of her shoes peeking over the crumbling brick ledge. "Hey, over here." The pounding grew louder behind me, and I shifted my weight against the door. Each strike reverberated up my spine, a grim reminder of the determination on the other side. My hands were damp, the sweat slicking the cold metal of the makeshift latch I had wedged in place. "They're not looking," Leah said, her voice sharper now. She raised one arm again, waving frantically. "Come on. We need help." I gritted my teeth. "They're not going to hear you. They can see us." She shot back, her frustration cutting through the tension like a jagged edge. The wind picked up, carrying with it the first scent of rain. It smelled metallic, like the memory of something lost. Leah began searching the rooftop, her movements quick and jittery, like a bird startled into flight. She grabbed a length of piping from the ground and hurled it across the gap. It clanged against the window of the adjacent building, the noise echoing briefly before the quiet reclaimed the space. One of the figures inside turned toward us. "There," she said, her voice breathless with hope. "They see us now." The pounding on the door was relentless. It was starting to give, the metal groaning under the strain. I leaned harder, but my arms ached with the effort, and I knew it couldn't hold much longer. "Do they look like they're coming to help?" I asked. Leah didn't answer right away. She was still staring across the gap, her body rigid as she waited for something, anything to happen. Finally, she exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "They're just standing there. Figures," I muttered. The door shuddered violently, and I stumbled slightly, catching myself just as the metal gave an ominous screech. "We need another plan," I said, my voice tight. Leah glanced back at me, her face pale but determined. "If they won't help, we have to get to them ourselves." "And how do you propose we do that?" Her eyes darted to the edge of the rooftop, then back to me. "We jump." I stared at her, the absurdity of the idea nearly making me laugh. The alley below was a graveyard of broken glass and twisted metal, and the gap between the buildings was too wide for anything but the desperate or the foolish. Before I could argue, the first crack splintered through the door behind me. It wasn't a subtle sound. It was the sharp, unmistakable snap of something breaking free. "They're coming," I said, my voice low. Leah stepped closer to the edge, her determination unwavering. She turned back to me, her eyes meeting mine. "If we stay here, we're done. If we jump, maybe..." She didn't finish the sentence, but the weight of it settled between us. The rain began to fall, light at first, but enough to make the rooftop slick beneath my boots. Another crack came from the door, louder this time, and I felt it shift against my back. "Fine," I said, pushing away from the door and joining her at the ledge. "Let's see if hope can fly." The rain, now a steady drizzle, blurred the lights across the gap, turning the windows into hazy beacons. Leah waved her arms frantically, her shouts drowned out by the storm and the relentless pounding behind us. I could feel the door buckling, the edges quivering as if the thing had grown impatient with its own stubbornness. "They're coming through," I warned, glancing over my shoulder. "Wait!" Leah yelled suddenly, her voice slicing through the chaos. "She sees us." My eyes snapped to the building opposite. A woman, barely visible in the dim glow of the window, raised her hand, a flashlight with a red beam of light piercing the darkness. It danced in deliberate patterns, landing on what I hadn't noticed before. A line stretched taut from her building to ours, hidden in the gloom. A zipline, Leah breathed, her voice trembling with something close to hope. I squinted at the setup. It was crude, a length of cord, thin and fraying in places, anchored to the mechanical unit behind us. It looked as if it had been cobbled together by someone with desperation in one hand and tools in the other. "She wants us to use it," Leah said, already moving toward it. "Do you trust that thing?" I asked, though I was already calculating. The door cracked behind me, splinters of wood and jagged metal flying as the horde began to spill through. "Do we have another choice?" She shot back. She grabbed the handle attached to the cord, a simple hook threaded with a loop of rope, and slipped it over the line. The beam of red light flickered briefly in what I could only interpret as encouragement. "Go," I urged, shoving her forward as the first shapes emerged from the shattered doorway. Leah hesitated for a fraction of a second, then leaped off the rooftop, her body swallowed by the rain and the dark. I watched her slide across the gap, her figure a fleeting shadow against the storm, and then she was gone, vanishing into the building opposite. The horde was on me now. Their movements were erratic, their limbs jerking as if pulled by invisible strings. Their faces were hollow, mouths agape in a grotesque mockery of hunger or need. I didn't think. I grabbed the second handle, hooked it onto the line, and pushed off. The wind roared in my ears, the rain slapping against my face as I hurtled across the void. Below me, the alley was a chaos of shuffling shapes and broken debris, a writhing sea of what the city had become. The line groaned under my weight, and for a terrible moment, I thought it would snap, sending me plummeting into the maw of the horde below. But then I was across, slamming into the railing of the other rooftop with a force that knocked the air from my lungs. Leah grabbed my arm, pulling me up and over. "Come on," she urged, dragging me toward the open window. Behind us, the horde reached the edge of the rooftop we'd just abandoned. For a heartbeat, they hesitated, as if the drop was enough to give even them pause. Then the first one jumped. It fell, flailing, and landed in the alley with a sickening crunch that I felt rather than heard. But more followed, leaping without hesitation, their broken forms scrambling to their feet as if gravity was merely an inconvenience. "They're coming," I yelled, shoving Leah through the window as the sound of bodies hitting the ground echoed in the storm. Inside, the woman who had signaled us was waiting. Her face was sharp, lined with exhaustion, but her eyes were bright, focused. She slammed the window shut behind me and bolted it, then jerked a thumb toward the interior of the building. "This way," she said, her voice low and commanding. We followed without question, the sounds of the horde outside pressing against the walls, a grotesque symphony of pursuit. The apartment was suffocating. The air hung thick with an unshakable mix of damp fabric, canned food, and a faint tang of desperation. Every surface seemed burdened with locks, bolts, and hastily hammered boards, an uneven symphony of survival. The woman moved quickly, her hands darting to secure the door behind us with an almost frantic precision. Each lock clicked into place with a metallic certainty that matched the tension in the room. "Don't touch anything," she muttered, not meeting our eyes. Leah and I stood awkwardly by the threshold, water pooling beneath us from the rain-soaked trek. I glanced at Leah, but she seemed fixated on the woman, her brow furrowed with curiosity, or maybe wariness. Finally, the woman turned. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, but alive with a sharpness that cut through the dim light. "You shouldn't have come here," she said flatly. "Do you know what I risked to pull that line? What you might have brought with you?" "We didn't have a choice," Leah said, her voice steady but edged. "It was either this or—" "I know what it was," the woman interrupted, her tone clipped. "I've been watching them long enough to know what they do." She paused, her gaze flicking to the window as though the world beyond was listening. "But that doesn't mean I have to like it." Her words stung, but it was her expression that dug deeper, a blend of mistrust and something colder, like she was calculating how much of a liability we might be. Leah stepped forward, shaking water from her jacket. "Look," she said, her voice firm, "we don't want trouble. We've had enough of that already. We're just unlucky, that's all." The woman tilted her head slightly, studying Leah as though weighing her sincerity. Then, after a beat, she let out a breath, long and slow. "Unlucky," she murmured. "That's one word for it." She walked to a small table pushed against the far wall, where a flickering candle struggled against the shadows. Her hands hovered over a collection of mismatched items. A map, a few scraps of paper, a knife that gleamed faintly in the low light. She picked up the knife not as a threat, but as if it was a habit, something familiar to hold. "If you want my help," she said, finally meeting our eyes, "you'll have to do something for me." The room seemed to tighten around her words, the air thickening with unspoken terms. "What do you mean?" Leah asked, her voice steady, but I could see the way her hands clenched at her sides. The woman's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I mean," she said, her tone measured, "that nothing comes for free. Not anymore." Her gaze shifted to me, sharp and unyielding. "You can stay here. I'll let you eat, rest. I'll even help you figure out what comes next." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "But only if you help me with something first." "And what's that?" I asked, my voice coming out hoarse, the exhaustion finally seeping through. Her eyes flickered toward the boarded-up window, then back to us. "There's something I need from out there, something I can't get myself. You'll bring it back to me." Leah exchanged a glance with me, her expression a mix of disbelief and defiance. "Are you serious?" she said, the disbelief winning out. The woman's face hardened. "Do I look like I'm joking?" The room fell silent, save for the distant thrum of the storm and the muffled groans of the things we'd barely escaped. "What is it you need?" I asked, already dreading the answer. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, as though testing my resolve. Then she stepped closer, her shadow stretching toward us like a warning. "It's a radio," she said, her voice dropping to a low, deliberate tone. "Not just any radio, a specific one. It's in the apartment across the hall." "Across the hall?" Leah repeated, incredulous. The woman nodded. "I've been watching. Still there. But so are they." The weight of her words settled heavily in the room. It was a trap one way or another. "And if we don't?" I asked quietly. The woman's expression didn't change. "Then you're on your own." The storm outside seemed to howl louder, as if it too was weighing our options. The woman's words hung in the stale air of the apartment, heavy and unyielding. She pointed to a small, worn map she had unfolded on the table, her finger tracing a path that led 3 floors down. "There," she said, her voice clipped and final. "Apartment 302. It has what I need." Leah stepped forward, her arms crossed tightly against her chest, her jaw set in defiance. "Why can't you come with us?" she demanded, the edge in her voice betraying the fear she tried to conceal. The woman didn't flinch. "It doesn't matter why. What matters is that I'm not going. You are." I watched the exchange, feeling the weight of Leah's glare shift to me. "This is insane," she said, her voice lowering but no less sharp. "We don't even know what we're looking for. What if she's sending us straight into—" "It doesn't matter," I interrupted, my own voice steadying as I spoke. "If this gets us out of here, it's worth it." Leah stared at me, her eyes flashing with something between betrayal and resignation. But she didn't argue. The woman nodded curtly, as if the decision had never been in question. "You'll need to be fast and quiet," she said, handing me a rusted piece of pipe that had clearly been repurposed as a weapon. "And don't linger. The less time you spend down there, the better." "What exactly are we looking for?" Leah asked, her tone cold. The woman hesitated, just for a moment. "A bag," she said finally. "You'll know it when you see it." I didn't trust her hesitation, but I couldn't afford to question it. Time felt like it was slipping away, each second bringing whatever lurked below closer to us. Leah muttered something under her breath but grabbed the pipe from my hand, testing its weight. "Fine," she said, her voice tight. "Let's get this over with." The woman opened the door and gestured toward the hallway, her face impassive. "You'll be on your own from here." We stepped out into the corridor, the air immediately colder and more oppressive. The dim light of the apartment gave way to near total darkness, save for the faint, flickering glow of an emergency light down the hall. Our footsteps echoed too loudly against the cracked tiles as we approached the stairwell. The descent felt endless. Each step down brought a fresh wave of unease, the shadows pressing in closer, as if they were alive. Leah moved ahead of me, her grip firm on the pipe. 3 floors, she whispered, as if saying it aloud would make it less daunting. The first landing was eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the faint creak of the building settling. But as we descended further, the air grew heavier, and an unmistakable scent of decay began to creep in. By the time we reached the second floor, the sound started, a faint, uneven shuffle coming from somewhere just out of sight. Leah froze, and I could see her knuckles whitening as she tightened her grip on the pipe. "Keep going," I whispered, though the words felt hollow in my throat. The third floor greeted us with an oppressive darkness, the emergency lights on this level long extinguished. I could feel Leah's breath quicken as we approached the door marked 302. I reached for the doorknob, the metal cold and slick under my palm. Slowly, I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. The apartment was a chaos of overturned furniture and scattered belongings, but the woman had been right. There was a bag, a black duffel sitting upright on a coffee table, looking untouched amidst the wreckage. "There," Leah said, her voice trembling but resolute. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my ears. As I reached for the bag, the shuffle we'd heard earlier grew louder, closer. "They're coming," Leah hissed, her voice tight with panic. I grabbed the bag and turned, my eyes meeting hers in the dim light. "Let's go." The shuffle turned into a scrape, then a thud. Whatever was out there wasn't far away. We bolted toward the stairs, the bag slung over my shoulder and my heart hammering in time with our footsteps. But as we reached the stairwell, a shadow moved at the far end of the hall, followed by another and then another. "They're blocking the way up," Leah said, her voice cracking. "Then we go down," I said, the words leaving my mouth before I could fully grasp their implication. And so we ran, plunging deeper into the building's darkness, the shuffle of pursuit growing louder behind us. The building was no longer just a structure of concrete and steel. It had become a labyrinth of dread, a place where every shadow threatened to spring to life. The air was heavy with the stench of decay, and each step felt like an invitation to disaster. Leah and I moved in unison, our breaths shallow, our footsteps barely audible on the cracked linoleum floor. The infected were everywhere, their shuffling forms drifting aimlessly through the hallways, their eyes clouded but vigilant. The slow, jerky movements of their limbs belied the danger they carried, an inevitability that pressed against us like the weight of the entire building. "Just a few more steps," I whispered, though the words were as much for me as they were for Leah. We rounded a corner, the dim emergency light casting long, grotesque shadows on the walls. Apartment 302 was in sight, its door slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the crack. Leah glanced at me, her expression unreadable in the gloom. With a nod, we crept toward it, each step deliberate, each sound a betrayal to the silence. As we reached the door, I pushed it open slowly, the hinges emitting a faint creak that seemed to echo down the hallway. The room beyond was eerily still, the faint outlines of furniture looming like silent sentinels. "There," Leah whispered, pointing to the bag resting on the table. Its presence was oddly jarring, an object so ordinary amidst the chaos. I stepped inside, the air thick and stale, as if the room had been waiting for us. My hand closed around the strap of the bag, and for a moment, relief flickered in my chest. But it was fleeting. A sound came from the hallway, a low, guttural moan, followed by the uneven thud of feet dragging against the floor. Leah froze, her eyes wide as she looked back toward the open door. "They know we're here," she said, her voice barely audible over the rising tension. The first shadow appeared in the doorway, then another. Their movements quickened, the lethargy of their shuffle replaced by a horrifying purpose. "Get inside," I hissed, yanking Leah by the arm. We slammed the door shut, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. Almost immediately, the pounding began. Fists, hands, and perhaps even heads collided with the wood, a relentless assault that made the hinges tremble. The groans and growls outside grew louder, a chorus of despair that filled every corner of the small apartment. Leah braced herself against the door, her hands trembling as she held it shut. "What now?" she asked, her voice sharp with panic. I looked around the room, desperate for options. The windows were barred, a cruel twist of fate in a city that once prided itself on safety. The walls felt as though they were closing in, the cacophony outside rising to a fever pitch. "We're trapped," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. Leah didn't respond. Her breathing was ragged, her eyes darting to the walls, the floor, the ceiling, as if an escape route might materialize if she looked hard enough. The pounding grew more frenzied, the door buckling under the strain. Every crash against it felt like a countdown, a grim metronome ticking toward the inevitable. "Help me!" Leah shouted, throwing her weight against the door. I joined her, my shoulder pressed to the wood, my muscles straining against the force on the other side. But it was futile. The infected were tireless, their hunger an unrelenting drive that no barricade could hold forever. The room itself seemed to pulse with the tension, the walls vibrating with the noise, the air heavy with our shared fear. "We need a plan," I said, though the words felt empty. Leah shook her head, her face pale and glistening with sweat. "There's no plan," she said, her voice breaking. There's nowhere to go, and she was right. For the first time since this nightmare began, the truth became painfully clear. We had run out of places to run. The door cracked under the weight of the assault, a jagged fissure spreading like a wound. On the other side, the infected screamed, their voices raw and inhuman. Time was slipping away, and with it, any chance of survival. The door shuddered against the weight of the infected, the jagged crack widening with every impact. In the growing chaos, I glanced toward the room's interior, desperate for anything to prolong the inevitable. My eyes caught something strange in the corner, a metallic gleam, almost surreal in the dim light. There, I said, pointing. Leah followed my gaze, stepping hesitantly into the room. The pounding at the door momentarily receded into the background as we focused on what lay ahead. Against the far wall, a rack of rifles and ammunition cases stood like an altar to some grim deity. The weaponry was neatly arranged, almost reverent in its placement, contrasting with the disarray of the rest of the apartment. And then there was the figure, slumped in a tattered armchair. The corpse of a man in a military uniform sat, his skeletal fingers curled around a radio transmitter. His head lolled at an unnatural angle, his sunken eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. A dark stain spread across his chest, evidence of a fatal wound. Leah recoiled, but I stepped closer, compelled by a grim fascination. A stack of documents lay on the small table beside him, their edges frayed as if they had been hastily rifled through. "What is this place?" Leah whispered, her voice barely audible over the incessant pounding at the door. I reached for the documents, flipping through yellowed pages filled with military jargon and hastily scrawled notes. "It's a forward operating post," I muttered, piecing the fragments together. "Looks like they were using this building as a fallback point." Leah's eyes landed on the radio in the man's hands. Without hesitation, she grabbed it and began fiddling with the dials, her movements hurried but precise. Static crackled through the device, a chaotic symphony of hissing and fragmented voices. "He was calling for help," she said, her fingers tightening around the transmitter. "This says their base was overrun. He must have stayed here, hoping someone would answer." The radio hissed and sputtered, the faint echoes of a voice breaking through the static. Leah adjusted the frequency, leaning closer as if proximity might clarify the sound. "Safe, west, evac point, repeat." Her breath hitched. "There's someone out there," she said, a flicker of hope piercing the oppressive dread. But before she could adjust further, the noise outside shifted. A strange, haunting melody filled the air, carried on the stale breeze through the cracked windows. It was music, distorted and tinny, yet unmistakably human. A distant song playing from somewhere within the building, or perhaps just beyond it. The infected stilled, their frenzied pounding slowing as they turned toward the sound. It was as if the music had awakened something primal in them, a memory of a life long forgotten. "What the hell is that?" Leah asked, her voice tight with alarm. I didn't answer, my focus torn between the music and the radio in her hands. As if sensing the shift, the device emitted a new sound, a sharp, intermitting beep, growing faster, more urgent. "Something's happening," I said, my voice trembling. The door gave another sharp crack, splinters flying into the room. The infected hadn't abandoned us entirely. They were simply distracted. The music and the radio seemed to compete for dominance, their sounds creating an eerie harmony that pressed against my skull. Leah clutched the radio tightly, her knuckles white. "We can't stay here," she said. the certainty in her voice cutting through the chaos. "No," I agreed, glancing again at the arsenal. "But we might have a fighting chance now." The infected outside stirred again. Their attention split between the fading music and the irresistible promise of flesh just beyond the door. The clock was ticking. We had weapons, we had a signal, and perhaps, just perhaps, a glimmer of hope. But as the door shuddered again, threatening to give way, it became painfully clear. Whatever chance we had would come at a price. The radio sputtered violently, filling the room with bursts of static and fragmented words. Leah hunched over the device, her brow furrowed in concentration, her fingers gripping the knob with a fierce desperation. "Say it again," she yelled, her voice raw. Through the chaos, a single word emerged, stark and unmistakable. "Rooftop," and then another, just as fragile. "Helicopter." Her breath caught, the weight of the moment hanging heavy between us. I stepped closer, clutching a rifle now loaded with trembling hands. "They're coming," Leah said, her voice a mix of hope and disbelief. "We have to get to the roof." "Not without her," I replied. The truth of it settled between us like an unspoken agreement. The woman upstairs, her terse commands, her desperate gamble to save us, was the only reason we weren't already a feast for the infected. Leaving her behind was not an option. Leah shoved the radio into her backpack, already packed with an assortment of grenades and ammunition scavenged from the room. She moved with a frantic efficiency, her every action deliberate. "We'll go back for her," she said, slinging the pack over her shoulders. "But if that helicopter doesn't wait..." "It will," I said firmly, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince. The music, faint and distorted, continued to weave through the corridors, its haunting melody still holding the infected in thrall. But even that was beginning to fade, the zombies outside the door regaining their frenzy. Time, always cruel, pressed against us like a vice. I glanced at the arsenal, grabbing a second rifle and shoving spare ammunition into my jacket pockets. Leah handed me a grenade, her expression grim. "Just in case," she muttered. We moved toward the door, every muscle tensed for the inevitable. The splintered wood groaned as I pulled it open, revealing a corridor lined with the shambling silhouettes of the infected. Their heads jerked unnaturally toward the distant music, their rotting frames swaying as if caught in a macabre dance. The melody was our lifeline. We slipped out, footsteps muffled against the stained carpet. Each step toward the stairs felt like a gamble, every breath an invitation for discovery. Leah walked just ahead, her hand gripping the canister of a grenade, ready to pull the pin at the slightest provocation. The ascent back to the woman's apartment was agonizingly slow, the infected clogging the stairwell in uneven clusters. The music, growing fainter with each passing second, barely masked the wet gurgles and shuffling feet. When we reached her door, Leah rapped sharply, 3 times, the sound like a gunshot in the suffocating silence. The door swung open almost immediately, her gaunt face framed in the sliver of light. "What the hell are you doing back?" she hissed. "Rescue's coming," Leah said, pushing past her. "We need to get to the roof." The woman's eyes flickered with disbelief, then something darker, an anger born of fear. "You've doomed us all," she said. But she grabbed a bag that had clearly been packed long before. The infected below began to stir more fervently, the last strains of music finally dying away. "Go," I barked, taking position at the door. Leah and the woman ran for the stairs, their footsteps pounding against the metal as I took aim at the first shadow to lurch forward. The rifle's crack split the air, and the infected collapsed in a heap, but the sound was like blood in the water. More surged forward, their groans rising in a crescendo. I fired again, then again, until my back hit the stairs and there was no choice but to follow. As we ascended, the chorus of the infected echoed behind us, the walls amplifying their relentless pursuit. Each step closer to the roof felt like an eternity, the weight of their numbers pressing on my heels. Bursting onto the rooftop, we were greeted by the cold bite of wind and the ominous churn of storm clouds. Lightning flashed, illuminating the city's skeletal skyline, and for a brief, harrowing moment, I saw them, dozens, maybe hundreds of infected spilling onto the rooftops around us, drawn by the gunfire. There, Leah shouted, pointing to the far edge of the roof. A makeshift helipad, crudely marked, stood as our only salvation. And in the distance, faint but growing louder, came the thrum of helicopter blades slicing through the storm. The door to the military apartment slammed shut behind us, the echo reverberating in the stale air. The momentary silence was broken only by our frantic breathing as we stumbled down the narrow corridor. There was no time to think, no space to mourn the chaos unfolding in the building. Each step felt like a march toward death, the smell of decay growing more unbearable with every turn. We were running out of ammunition, and the weight of every shot lingered like a curse. With each bullet fired, the numbers of the dead grew, swelling the ranks of our pursuers. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls closing in on us as we approached the woman's apartment. When we finally burst through the door, I froze. She was slumped on the floor, her pale skin almost translucent in the dim light. Blood pooled beneath her, staining the floorboards a deep, unnatural red. Her eyes flickered open just as Leah knelt beside her. "Not now," she whispered, struggling to sit up. "I didn't think you'd make it back. I didn't think you would be foolish enough to return." The woman's voice was shaky, thick with pain and bitterness. She looked at Leah and then at me. Her lips trembled as she spoke again. "They've come for us. The military. They're murderers. They killed my group. They're not here to rescue you." Leah's face drained of color. "What are you talking about?" The woman, her breathing shallow, motioned for us to come closer. "You didn't understand. You thought you could escape. That helicopter isn't a savior. It's just the beginning. They're gonna take you and anyone they find. That's all they're doing, picking off the survivors one by one." I felt the ground shift beneath me. The desperate hope that had been growing inside me shattered like glass, the shards cutting deep. The sound of groans and shuffling feet echoed from the stairwell. The dead were coming, and they were closer than ever. The woman looked toward the door, the color draining from her face as she saw the growing horde. "They'll be here in moments," she said, her voice a mixture of resignation and fury. "Go. Now." But Leah refused to leave without her. "We can help you. We can get you out of here." The woman shook her head slowly, a sad smile curling at the corners of her mouth. "No, there's no way out for me." Her gaze drifted to Leah's backpack, where she'd placed the grenades. Without another word, she grabbed them. "I'll buy you time," she said with a cold finality that made my stomach twist. "No!" Leah shouted, but the woman was already moving toward the door. The crunch of bones underfoot sounded like thunder as the first of the infected crashed into the hallway. The woman didn't hesitate. She pulled the pin from the grenade and threw it into the darkened corridor, where the dead were beginning to gather. As the explosion tore through the air, the building shook, sending a shudder of destruction through the walls. The sound of screams mixed with the roar of the blast, the shockwave rattling the windows. Leah and I didn't look back. We didn't need to. We raced to the fire escape, the sound of the building crumbling behind us, the distant echoes of death following our every step. The stairs were slick with rain and blood, the world tilting beneath our feet as we made our way to the ground. We hit the street running, gasping for breath, the cold air searing our lungs. The distant thrum of the helicopter, faint but unmistakable, cut through the thickening fog. The city had become a maze of rubble, the streets littered with the detritus of a world undone. I shoved Leah into the back of the taxi, my hands shaking as I slammed the door shut. We had no destination, but the sound of the helicopter kept us moving forward. "Where?" Leah asked, her voice hoarse, her eyes wide with exhaustion. "Port," I replied, gripping the wheel tight. "We'll find safety there. We'll find something." The engine roared to life as the taxi tore through the empty streets, its tires screeching on the cracked pavement. Behind us, the world burned, a nightmare unfolding in real time. The helicopter's blades sliced through the air above us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was just another mirage, a fleeting hope that would vanish as quickly as it had come. Leah sat beside me, her gaze distant, her thoughts racing ahead to a future neither of us could predict. The city was dying around us, its pulse fading with every passing moment. But there was still hope, a small, fragile flame, flickering in the storm. I pressed my foot to the gas, the taxi charging into the unknown, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The helicopter's sound was growing louder now, but what lay ahead remained hidden, an uncertain horizon. In the distance, the storm rumbled, ready to break open the sky. The world may have ended, but for now we had survived.